The Caribbean sun blazed like molten gold across the endless expanse of turquoise water as Captain Nathaniel Cross stood at the weathered bow of his ship, the Crimson Tide. His calloused hands, marked by years of rope burn and sword work, gripped the salt-stained rail as he surveyed the horizon through his brass spyglass. The year was 1698, and these waters around Jamaica had become a deadly crossroads where fortunes were made and lost with each tide, where men's souls were weighed against Spanish gold, and where the line between hero and villain shifted like the Caribbean winds. Nathaniel Cross was 32 years old, though the relentless sun and harsh life at sea had carved lines around his steel-grey eyes that made him appear older. His dark hair, streaked with premature silver, was tied back in the traditional sailor's queue, and a thin scar ran from his left temple to his jawline, a permanent reminder of the night that had changed everything. He was no ordinary pirate, not one of the bloodthirsty cutthroats who had given the Black Flag its terrifying reputation. Cross carried with him a burden that had shaped every decision he'd made for the past 5 years, a weight that pressed upon his conscience like the deepest ocean depths. The captain had not been born to this life of outlawry and rebellion. The youngest son of a respected blacksmith in Portsmouth, England, Nathaniel had possessed dreams that reached far beyond the smoky forge and the ring of hammer on anvil. At 17, driven by tales of adventure and honor, he had joined His Majesty's Royal Navy with the starry-eyed enthusiasm of youth. He had believed, with the absolute certainty that only the young can possess, that he would serve the crown with distinction, that he would protect the innocent and uphold justice on the far reaches of the empire. Those noble dreams had sustained him through the brutal training, the harsh discipline, and the long months at sea aboard HMS Righteous, a third-rate ship of the line that patrolled the shipping lanes between England and the Caribbean colonies. For 3 years, Cross had served with distinction. He had proven himself in battle against French privateers, had shown courage under fire, and had earned the respect of both his fellow sailors and his officers. His captain, Sir Edmund Whitmore, had marked him for promotion, had spoken of a bright future in the service of King William. But all of that had crumbled to ash one terrible night off the coast of Madagascar, when Cross had discovered that the very system he served was built upon corruption that reached to its core. It had started as a routine patrol. The HMS Righteous had encountered a Portuguese slave ship, the Santa Isabella, wallowing low in the water with its human cargo. Standard procedure called for the British ship to inspect the vessel's papers and ensure that the slave trade was being conducted according to the various international treaties that governed such commerce. What Cross had not expected was to witness his own captain, the man he had looked up to as a paragon of naval virtue, conducting a secret negotiation with the Portuguese slave trader. From his position on the quarterdeck, Cross had watched in growing horror as Captain Whitmore accepted a chest of gold and silver in exchange for allowing the Santa Isabella to continue its voyage unmolested. Worse yet, Whitmore had ordered the ship's log to reflect that they had encountered the vessel and found it had escaped before inspection could be completed. The young lieutenant had realized with sickening clarity that this was not the first such transaction, that his captain had been profiting from human misery while maintaining the facade of righteous service to the crown. When Cross had confronted Whitmore privately, demanding an explanation, the captain's response had shattered what remained of the young man's faith in the system he served. "You naive fool," Whitmore had sneered, his genteel accent suddenly seeming like the hiss of a serpent. "Do you think this navy runs on patriotism and honor alone? Do you believe the Admiralty cares how we maintain order in these waters, as long as the shipping lanes remain open and the colonial taxes continue to flow? The slave trade is the foundation of our empire's wealth, boy, and those who serve that empire are entitled to their share of the profits." Cross had threatened to report the corruption to the Admiralty, had spoken of duty and honour and the oaths they had all sworn. Whitmore's response had been swift and merciless. Within hours, Cross had found himself charged with mutiny, theft, and attempted desertion. The evidence against him had been fabricated with professional skill, stolen goods planted in his sea chest, forged documents suggesting correspondence with French agents, testimony from carefully bribed sailors. At his court-martial, held aboard the ship with Whitmore serving as both accuser and judge, Cross had been found guilty and sentenced to be marooned on the next uninhabited island they encountered. The island had been a barren spit of sand and rock somewhere in the Indian Ocean, marked on no chart and visited by no ships. Cross had been left with only the clothes on his back, a rusty cutlass, and a single day's ration of water. Whitmore had sailed away without looking back, confident that the ocean would claim another inconvenient truth, and that his secrets would die with the waves. For 3 months, Cross had lived like a savage, eating raw fish and birds' eggs, collecting rainwater in makeshift containers fashioned from driftwood and seaweed. He had grown gaunt and wild, his naval uniform rotting away in strips, his skin burned dark by the unforgiving sun. He had watched dozens of ships pass on the horizon, had built signal fires that went unnoticed, had shouted himself hoarse at vessels too distant to hear his cries. Death had seemed not just inevitable, but welcome when the black sails of a pirate ship finally appeared on the horizon. The crew of the Vengeful Spirit had found him more skeleton than man, barely alive and half mad from isolation and despair. Their captain, a grizzled Welshman named Gareth Morgan, had taken pity on the castaway and had offered him a choice: join the crew or be left to die where they had found him. Cross had chosen life, and in doing so had chosen the path that led him to this moment, standing on the deck of his own ship 5 years later, master of his own destiny and captain of 43 souls who had, like him, found in piracy the freedom that civilization had denied them. The crew of the Crimson Tide was as diverse as the Caribbean itself, a brotherhood forged not by birth or nationality, but by shared experience of injustice and a common desire for liberty. There was Miguel Santos, a former Spanish soldier who had fled the Inquisition after refusing to torture suspected heretics in the New World. His knowledge of Spanish military tactics and fortifications had proved invaluable in their raids against Spanish shipping. Kofi Asante, a freed slave from the Gold Coast of Africa, served as the ship's navigator, his inherited knowledge of ocean currents and stellar navigation surpassing that of most European sailors. One-eyed Pete, an English deserter who had lost his left eye to a French cannonball at the Battle of Steenkerke, served as the ship's gunner, his skill with artillery legendary among the pirate brotherhood. There was Jean-Baptiste Moreau, a former French naval officer who had been cashiered for refusing to fire on a hospital ship during the War of the League of Augsburg. Thomas Blackwood, a Scottish Jacobite who had fled to the Caribbean after the failed rising of 1689. Roberto Silva, a Portuguese sailor who had escaped the Inquisition's prisons in Goa. Each man had his story, his reasons for choosing the black flag over the colors of king and country. But what united them was more than shared outlawry. Cross had built their loyalty not through fear or greed, but through fairness and a code of conduct that protected the weak and honored courage. Unlike many pirate crews that ruled through brutality and terror, the men of the Crimson Tide had sworn an oath to never harm innocents, to share all spoils equally, and to stand by their shipmates in battle and in peace. It was a code that had made them both feared and respected throughout the Caribbean, a reputation that opened some doors and closed others. The afternoon that would change the course of all their lives began with the kind of routine that had become second nature to the crew of the Crimson Tide. For 2 days, they had been shadowing a Spanish merchant galleon, the San Miguel, keeping just below the horizon while they studied their target's course and habits. The ship was clearly heavy in the water, riding low with what appeared to be a valuable cargo. But Cross had noticed something else through his spyglass that made his stomach turn with a familiar nausea. The distinctive configuration of the galleon's upper deck, with its heavy grating and reinforced hatches, marked it as a vessel engaged in the slave trade. Even at a distance of several miles, the smell had begun to reach them on the wind, that unmistakable stench of human misery that marked ships carrying their cargo of stolen lives. As the sun reached its zenith on the third day of their pursuit, Cross made the decision to attack. The black flag was raised to the mainmast, its skull and crossed cutlasses snapping in the trade wind like a declaration of war against all legitimate authority. The crew sprang into action with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this dance many times before. Miguel Santos supervised the gun crews as they loaded the cannons with chain shot designed to cripple the galleon's rigging rather than sink her outright. Kofi Asante took his position at the helm, his dark hands steady on the wheel as he guided the Crimson Tide into the wind gauge, positioning their ship to control the coming engagement. One-Eyed Pete prepared the swivel guns mounted along the rail, loading them with bags of musket balls that could sweep an enemy deck clear of defenders. The Spanish galleon, caught by surprise in open water with no hope of escape, offered only token resistance. Captain Diego Hernandez, a portly man whose gold-capped teeth gleamed in the Caribbean sun, struck his colors after the first broadside brought down his mainmast and left the San Miguel wallowing helplessly in the swells. As Cross led the boarding party across the gap between the ships, his cutlass drawn but not bloodied, he could see the resignation in the Spanish captain's eyes. This was not Hernandez's first encounter with pirates, and he clearly understood the realities of his situation. "Take what you will, pirate dog," Hernandez spat in heavily accented English, his hands raised but his eyes burning with hatred and humiliation. "But know that you steal from lawful Spanish commerce, conducted under the authority of His Catholic Majesty. Touch my cargo, and you will answer to the Crown of Spain and the Holy Inquisition itself." Cross said nothing in response to the Spanish captain's bluster. He had heard similar threats before, and they meant nothing to a man who had already been declared an enemy of all civilized nations. Instead, he gestured for his quartermaster, Robert MacLeod, to follow him as he made his way toward the ship's hold. MacLeod was a grizzled Scotsman who had served with Cross since their early days together under Captain Morgan. His weathered face bore the scars of a dozen battles, and his eyes held the kind of hard-won wisdom that came from seeing the worst of human nature without losing one's own humanity. What they found when they descended into the San Miguel's hold made even these hardened men of the sea pause in horror. The compartment had been divided into a series of cramped platforms, creating multiple levels where human beings could be stored like cargo. Nearly 200 African men, women and children were chained in conditions that would have shamed any rational person. The stench was overwhelming, a mixture of human waste, vomit and death that seemed to coat the inside of their nostrils and cling to their clothes. Many of the captives appeared to be dying from disease and dehydration, their eyes dull with the kind of despair that came from having hope systematically beaten out of them. "Jesus Christ and all the saints," MacLeod whispered, his Scottish burr thick with emotion. "I've seen the inside of English prisons, Spanish dungeons and French galleys, but this is worse than anything civilized men should visit upon their fellow creatures." Cross moved slowly through the cramped space, his eyes adjusting to the dim light that filtered down through the grated hatches above. Most of the captives watched him with a mixture of fear and resignation, having learned through bitter experience that white men meant pain and degradation. But in the far corner of the hold, partially hidden behind a support timber, Cross noticed a young man who couldn't have been more than 20 years old. Unlike the others, whose spirits seemed broken by weeks or months of captivity, This one's eyes still burned with defiant intelligence, even as his body clearly fought against fever and the exhaustion that came from prolonged dehydration. Cross knelt beside the young man, noting the intricate patterns of scarification that decorated his chest and shoulders. These were not the random marks of slavery or punishment, but the deliberate artistry of a culture that honored learning and nobility. The young man's features, though gaunt from his ordeal, showed the kind of refined bone structure that spoke of good breeding and education. His hands, though now chained and calloused from rough treatment, showed the long fingers and careful movements of someone accustomed to delicate work. "What is your name?" Cross asked softly in English, then repeated the question in the few words of Portuguese and Spanish he had learned during his years in the Caribbean. The young man studied him for a long moment, his intelligent eyes taking in Cross's appearance, the quality of his weapons, the fact that he had knelt down rather than standing over him like a master addressing a slave. When he finally spoke, it was in heavily accented but grammatically correct English. "My name is Kwame Nkrumah. In my homeland, before these Spanish dogs stole me from my family, I was a teacher in my village. I spoke 5 languages and could read the ancient texts of my people. Now I am nothing but cargo, to be sold like a goat or a bag of grain." Cross reached for his own water skin, a leather container that held the last of his personal water supply, carefully rationed and saved for the long journey that lay ahead. Without hesitation, he uncorked the container and tilted it to Kwame's lips, letting the precious liquid flow slowly to avoid overwhelming the man's parched throat. As Kwame drank, Cross could see the tears of gratitude that mixed with the water running down his face. "Why?" Kwame asked when he had finished drinking, his voice stronger now but still filled with wonder. "Why does a pirate, a white man, an enemy, show kindness to one such as me?" Cross was quiet for a moment, his mind traveling back to that terrible night off Madagascar, when he had learned that the world was not the place he had thought it to be, when he had discovered that justice was not something that could be taken for granted, but something that had to be fought for, sometimes against the very institutions that claimed to represent it. "Because someone should have helped me once when I needed it most, and no one did. Because in this world, if we do not show mercy to each other, who will show mercy to us? Because it is right, and sometimes being right is more important than being safe or profitable or acceptable to the powers that rule this world." The simple act of sharing water seemed to send ripples through the entire hold, like a stone dropped into still water. Other captives who had been watching the exchange began to sit up straighter, to whisper among themselves in the various African languages that represented dozens of different tribes and kingdoms. Word of the pirate captain who had shown kindness to one of their own traveled through the cramped space faster than Cross could have imagined, carried by looks and gestures, and the kind of communication that transcends spoken language. When Cross finally returned to the upper deck, he found his crew waiting for orders, their faces grim as they contemplated the scene they had witnessed below. Captain Hernandez stood under guard near the mainmast, his face red with indignation and his gold-capped teeth flashing as he hurled curses in rapid Spanish. Around him, his own crew members stood with their hands raised, clearly more interested in survival than in defending their captain's cargo. "You had no right to go below decks without my permission," Hernandez snarled when he saw Cross emerge from the hold. "Those are legally acquired goods, purchased with proper documentation from the Portuguese authorities in Angola and destined for the sugar plantations of Cuba. Every transaction has been conducted according to the laws of Spain and the treaties that govern legitimate commerce in these waters." Cross drew his cutlass and placed the tip against Hernandez's throat, the sharp steel just barely touching the soft flesh above the Spanish captain's collar. "Legal according to whom? Men who steal people from their families and treat them like livestock? officials who profit from human misery while hiding behind the authority of kings and churches. "You are pirates," Hernandez protested, his voice rising in pitch as he felt the cold steel against his skin. "Criminals and outcasts who live outside the law. You have no moral authority to judge the actions of legitimate merchants conducting lawful business under the protection of civilized governments." "Maybe not," Cross admitted, his voice deadly calm. "But I have this ship, these cannons, and the power to choose what happens next. And right now, that gives me all the authority I need." The decision that followed would be debated in taverns and coffee houses across the Caribbean for years to come, would inspire ballads and stories and heated arguments about the nature of justice and the responsibilities of power. Cross ordered his crew to break the chains of every captive aboard the San Miguel to distribute the ship's food and water supplies among the freed Africans, and to give them a choice about their future. They could take the smaller boats and try to reach the mainland, where some might find freedom in the maroon communities that existed in the mountains of Jamaica and other islands. They could join his crew if they wished, becoming pirates themselves and taking up arms against the system that had enslaved them. Or they could take the Spanish galleon itself, along with its navigation equipment and sufficient supplies, to attempt the long journey back to Africa. "Captain," MacLeod warned quietly, pulling Cross aside as the crew began implementing his orders, "we're giving up a fortune here. That Spanish gold alone would have kept us comfortable for months, and the ship itself is worth more than everything we've taken in the past year. The crew won't understand, and some of them might not accept it." Cross looked at his quartermaster, a man whose loyalty had never been in question, whose judgment he trusted above all others. Then he looked at the Spanish treasure that lay scattered on the deck, chests of gold and silver that represented the profits of human suffering. Finally, he looked at the faces of 200 people who had been merchandise an hour earlier and were now free to choose their own destiny. "Some things are worth more than gold, Robert," he said finally. "Some prices are too high to pay, no matter what profit they might bring. Any man in this crew who disagrees with that philosophy is welcome to take his share of previous plunder and find another ship to serve on." To Cross's surprise, not a single member of his crew expressed disagreement with his decision. Miguel Santos, who had lived under Spanish oppression and understood what freedom meant to those who had been denied it, was the first to voice his support. Kofi Asante, who had escaped slavery himself and knew the value of what they were doing, organized the distribution of supplies with careful efficiency. Even One-Eyed Pete, who had joined the crew purely for profit and had never shown much interest in moral philosophy, seemed moved by the captain's decision. As the preparations continued throughout the afternoon, Cross found himself approached by Kwame, who had managed to find clothing among the Spanish crew's possessions, and now looked more like the educated man he claimed to be, rather than the broken slave he had appeared just hours earlier. Despite his obvious weakness from his ordeal, Kwame insisted on speaking with Cross before the ships parted ways. "My people have a saying," Kwame said, his English now flowing more smoothly as strength returned to his body. "We believe that when you save a life, life saves you back. This is not just gratitude, but a law of the universe as certain as the tides or the movement of the stars. You have saved not just my life, but the lives of all my people here. You have chosen justice over profit, humanity over gold. You must remember this, because what you have set in motion today will return to you in ways you cannot imagine." As the sun began to set, painting the Caribbean sky in shades of gold and crimson that reflected off the calm waters, the liberated Africans sailed away in the captured Spanish galleon. Some had chosen to join Cross's crew, bringing their knowledge of other languages and their burning desire for revenge against the slave trade. Others had taken the smaller boats, hoping to reach the sanctuary of the maroon settlements. But the majority had chosen to attempt the dangerous journey home, navigating by stars and currents that their ancestors had known for generations. Cross watched the galleon disappear over the horizon and felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of peace that came from knowing he had done the right thing regardless of the cost. The Crimson Tide had given up tremendous wealth, but they had gained something more valuable than any treasure. They had struck a blow against a system that treated human beings as commodities, and they had done it in a way that honored the dignity of those they had helped. For 3 days, following the encounter with the Spanish slave ship, life aboard the Crimson Tide returned to something approaching normal. They sailed northward toward the shipping lanes near Hispaniola, hoping to encounter a French merchantman that Kofi had spotted several days earlier. The crew went about their usual duties with their characteristic efficiency, but there was something different in the air, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere piracy. The African crew members who had joined them shared stories of their homelands, their knowledge of coastal navigation, and their understanding of the complex political relationships between different tribal groups. On the morning of the 4th day, Cross was awakened by urgent shouts from the crow's nest. "Ships on the horizon, Captain! Many ships approaching from the southeast." Cross grabbed his spyglass and climbed quickly to the highest point on his vessel, his bare feet finding purchase on the rigging with the ease of long practice. What he saw through the lens defied explanation and challenged everything he thought he knew about the Caribbean. Spread across the dawn horizon was a fleet unlike anything he had ever witnessed, a collection of vessels that seemed to have appeared from nowhere and moved with a coordination that suggested experienced seamanship and unified command. There were at least 20 ships of various sizes and configurations. Some were clearly of African construction, with the distinctive shallow draft and flexible rigging that allowed for navigation of coastal waters and river mouths. Others were European vessels that had been modified with additional sails and reinforced hulls. Still, others appeared to be hybrid designs that combined elements of both traditions, creating ships that were unlike anything in the standard naval manuals. As the mysterious fleet approached, Cross could see that the lead vessel was flying a white flag of parley, the universal signal for peaceful intentions. His first mate, Jean-Baptiste Moreau, joined him in the rigging with his own spyglass, his experienced eye taking in the details of the approaching ships. "Captain," Jean-Baptiste said slowly, his French accent thick with amazement, "I believe those are the freed slaves from the Spanish ship, but look at their numbers, look at the quality of their vessels. This is not a group of escaped captives trying to reach safety, this is a fleet." Cross focused his glass on the lead ship and felt his breath catch in his throat. Standing at the bow, no longer the dying man from the Spanish ship's hold, but clearly recovered and wearing what appeared to be ceremonial robes of office, was Kwame. Behind him stood dozens of other Africans, but these were not the broken captives they had freed. These were warriors, their bodies marked with the ritual scars and paint of different tribes, carrying spears and shields that gleamed with brass and gold in the morning sun. As the lead ship drew alongside the Crimson Tide, Kwame called out in clear, strong English that carried easily across the water, "Captain Cross, permission to come aboard your vessel. I bring greetings from the Free Coast Alliance and an offer that will change your life." Cross ordered rope ladders dropped over the side, and Kwame climbed up with an agility that completely belied his recent ordeal. Behind him came a dozen other men, each clearly a leader of some kind, their bearing and dress marking them as representatives of different African kingdoms and tribal confederations. As they assembled on the deck of the Crimson Tide, Cross realized that he was looking at something unprecedented in his experience, a gathering of African royalty and military commanders who had somehow found each other in the vast expanse of the Caribbean. "My friend," Kwame said, clasping Cross's hand in both of his own with genuine warmth, "you gave water to a dying man and thought you were performing one small act of kindness. But you did much more than save a single life. You saved Kwame Nkrumah, son of the Ashanti king Tutu. You saved Abdou Traore, nephew of the Yoruba chief Adeyemi. You saved Jengo Mandela, cousin of the Dahomey warrior Prince Agaja. When we reached the shores of Jamaica 3 days ago, word of what you had done spread like wildfire through every maroon settlement, every community of free Africans, every group of escaped slaves who have made their home in these islands. Another man stepped forward, his military bearing unmistakable even in civilian dress. He was tall and powerfully built, with the kind of scars that spoke of serious combat experience. "I am General Bomani of the Blue Mountain Maroons," he said in English that carried only a slight accent. "For 10 years, my people have been fighting a guerrilla war against the British colonial authorities in Jamaica. When we heard what you had done, when we learned that there was a white pirate captain who saw Africans as human beings rather than cargo, we knew we had found something rare and precious in this world of slavery and oppression." A third man, his skin bearing the distinctive scarification patterns of the Fula people of West Africa, stepped forward with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "I am Amadou Bello, and I speak for the traders and merchants among our people. You freed our royal blood, our teachers, our craftsmen, our warriors. In our traditions, such a debt cannot be repaid with gold or silver, but only with loyalty and service." Cross looked around his deck, then at the fleet of ships that surrounded his vessel like a protective barrier, then back at the faces of the men who stood before him. "What is it that you want from me? What are you offering?" Kwame smiled, and in that expression Cross could see the intelligence and nobility that no amount of chains or degradation could destroy. "Not what we want from you, Captain Cross. What we want to give to you. You showed honor when you could have chosen profit. You chose justice when you could have chosen gold. You treated our people with dignity when you could have treated them as cargo. In all our different traditions, from the kingdoms of the Gold Coast to the warrior societies of the Congo, such actions create debts that must be repaid." General Bomani gestured toward the surrounding ships, and Cross could see that many of them were filled with armed men whose disciplined formations spoke of military training. "We offer you alliance, Captain Cross. 200 freed men and women have chosen to join the fight against the slave traders who destroyed their lives. We offer you safe harbor in places where British and Spanish colonial authorities cannot reach. Hidden coves and mountain strongholds where your ship can be repaired and reprovisioned. We offer you information about every slave ship that moves through these waters, intelligence that will allow you to strike where you can do the most good." Amadou Bello stepped forward, his dark eyes bright with enthusiasm. "And we offer you legitimate commerce to supplement your piracy. Spices from secret gardens hidden in the mountains, gold dust panned from streams that appear on no European maps, ivory and precious woods harvested by free men rather than slaves, trade that honors our ancestors and builds our communities instead of destroying our families." A fourth man, whose massive frame and ritual scars marked him as a warrior of the Mandinka people, added his voice to the chorus. "I am Sundiata Keita, war chief of the Windward Islands Maroons. We offer you military alliance against all who traffic in human flesh. Your enemies will become our enemies, and our enemies will become yours. No slave ship will pass through these waters without facing the combined wrath of the Free Coast Alliance." Cross felt the weight of what was being offered, the magnitude of the opportunity that had grown from his simple act of sharing water with a dying man. This wasn't just about piracy anymore, wasn't just about taking Spanish gold or striking back at the system that had wronged him. This was about something larger, a network that could challenge the entire structure of slavery in the Caribbean, a confederation of free Africans and sympathetic Europeans who could create their own alternative to the colonial powers. But he also understood the dangers that came with such an alliance. If we work together as you suggest, we become targets for every colonial power in these waters. Spain, Britain, France, Portugal, the Dutch, they will all want us dead. They will put aside their own conflicts to destroy us because we represent a threat to the foundation of their wealth in the New World. They already want you dead, Kwame pointed out with a slight smile. You're already a pirate, already an outlaw, already marked for death by every navy and every colonial governor in the Caribbean. But now, instead of facing them alone with just your single ship and your brave crew, you will have allies who know these waters as well as any European, who can strike from hidden bases and melt away into territories where no colonial authority dares to follow. The alliance that was formalized that morning would reshape the nature of piracy in the Caribbean for the next decade and would create legends that would be told for centuries. Cross found himself not just the captain of a single vessel, but the admiral of a confederation that included escaped slaves, maroon communities, sympathetic merchants, and even some progressive ship captains who had grown disgusted with the brutality of the slave trade. They called themselves the Free Fleet, and their reputation spread across the Caribbean like wildfire, striking fear into the hearts of slave traders and inspiring hope in the hearts of the oppressed. The Spanish authorities, recognizing the threat that the Free Fleet represented to their colonial economy, placed a massive bounty on Cross's head. The sum was so large that it attracted every bounty hunter, privateer, and ambitious naval officer in the Caribbean. But every attempt to capture Cross and his allies failed, often spectacularly. The maroon communities provided intelligence about naval movements and safe harbor when pursuit became too intense. The freed Africans who had joined the fleet brought knowledge of languages and customs that made them incredibly effective at infiltrating slave ports and liberating ships before they could reach their destinations. Within 2 years, the Free Fleet had freed over 3,000 enslaved people and had become such a threat to the slave trade that Spanish colonial authorities were forced to reroute their shipping and provide armed escorts for every vessel carrying human cargo. The economic impact was enormous, disrupting the flow of slave labor to the sugar plantations and forcing plantation owners to pay free wages to attract workers. The political impact was even greater, as news of the Free Fleet's successes spread to slave communities throughout the Americas and inspired rebellions and escape attempts from Virginia to Brazil. Cross never forgot the lesson of that morning when he had shared his last water with a dying man. Kwame had been right about the ancient saying, "When you save a life, life saves you back." But the salvation had been bigger and more complex than anything Cross could have imagined. In choosing compassion over profit, in treating enslaved Africans as human beings rather than cargo, he had found not just allies, but a purpose that gave meaning to everything he did. The story of Captain Nathaniel Cross and the Free Fleet became legend throughout the Caribbean and beyond. Sailors in every port from Havana to Port Royal told the tale of the pirate who gave his last water to a slave and woke up the next morning to find an army of free men at his side. The tale grew in the telling, as such stories always do, but at its heart remained a simple truth that resonated across all cultures and all conditions. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change the world in ways that no amount of gold or political power ever could. Years later, when Cross was an old man living peacefully in a maroon settlement high in the Blue Mountains of Jamaica, surrounded by children and grandchildren whose freedom had been purchased with his courage, visitors would still seek him out to hear the story of the day 200 ships appeared at dawn. He would always end the tale the same way, with the words that Kwame had spoken that first day in the Spanish ship's hold. Some things are worth more than gold. Some choices matter more than profit. And when you choose what is right over what is safe, when you choose compassion over convenience, the world has a way of rewarding that choice in ways you never expected and never could have planned. The Free Fleet continued operating long after Cross retired from active piracy, a testament to the power of moral courage and the recognition that freedom, once tasted, becomes the most precious treasure of all. The Spanish, British, and French authorities never fully understood how a simple act of sharing water with a dying man had created their greatest nightmare in the Caribbean, had spawned a movement that would eventually contribute to the abolition of slavery throughout the Americas. But for those who lived through it, the lesson was clear. Compassion is not weakness, justice is not naivety, and sometimes the greatest revolutions begin not with grand gestures or political declarations, but with the smallest acts of human decency performed when no one is watching and no reward is expected. In the end, Captain Nathaniel Cross discovered something that few pirates of his era ever learned, something that no amount of stolen Spanish gold could teach. The treasure that matters most is not measured in coins or jewels, but in the bonds we forge with our fellow human beings and the legacy of justice we leave behind for future generations. The water he had shared with Kwame that day had cost him nothing more than temporary thirst, but the debt of gratitude it had created had bought him something more valuable than any galleon's hold full of silver. A place in history as a man who chose right over might, who chose humanity over profit, and who found himself surrounded by the most loyal allies any man could hope for when he needed them most.